June 2015. It's a balmy summer in Macon, a mid-sized city located 85 miles south of Atlanta and known as the heart of Georgia.
It's very affordable, a great place to raise a family.
It's not too country, it's not too city. I think it's the perfect blend.
But just after midnight on June 12th, the quiet city is jolted by an urgent call to the Bibb County Sheriff's Office from local pastor William Pounds.
What's the emergency?
Ma'am, my girlfriend, she shot herself in the head. I need an ambulance, please. I need somebody here.
Yes, sir. I can get them in route for you, okay? But I need you to try to calm down for me.
Oh, Jesus.
On the 911 call, William is panicking and Kendra is in dire need of medical attention.
She's not breathing.
Okay.
She's not breathing. I'm going to do CPR on her.
Okay. All right. 1, 2, 3, 4,
2,
4,
3,
1,
4,
2,
5,
3,
6,
4,
7,
1,
8,
2,
9,
3.
As William fights to keep Kendra alive, first responders race to the scene. Every second is critical.
As the minutes tick by, Kendra's chances of survival grow dimmer.
For as long as anyone could remember, 46-year-old Kendra Jackson had been a beacon of light in her community.
Kendra was a sweetheart. When she showed up, she brought the sun with her.
People loved her. They say that she was a good mix of sassy and classy.
When you say classy, you say Kendra. You just knew she was gonna look her best, speak her best, present her best at all times.
The daughter of a reverend, Kendra was raised in a devoutly religious household alongside her 3 siblings.
Growing up in a Christian home, especially when your parents are involved in preaching, it can have a big influence on you, and there's a lot of pressure to always do your best.
That kind of defined her trajectory in life.
And nothing in Kendra's life was more important to her than motherhood.
Kendra got married at a young age. Her and her husband had 3 kids.
But the relationship between Ms. Jackson and her husband was not as strong as they had hoped, and they ended up growing apart and divorced.
In the years following the divorce, Kendra worked hard to give her children a good upbringing.
Okay, great. She was very loving towards her kids. Her kids were the priority.
Take care of that for you.
She was able to eventually find a good job as a personal banker. She had a part-time job working in a jewelry store.
I'm like, girl, why you working 2 jobs? Because she was trying to take care of people.
A little busy girl.
If anyone could handle the stress of motherhood and work, it was Kendra.
Take care of.
We call her Michelle Obama. Like if she was having a bad day, she would have the classiest bad day ever. She was always in mama mode and let me make it better for you mode.
Kendra was the total package. So it seemed only a matter of time before a new suitor came knocking.
She's maintained her faith that God would provide her a good man.
Can I help you?
Yes, I have some questions about my bank account there.
Okay, let me take a look.
William Pounds was a prominent preacher, and he was also a senior master sergeant in the Air Force.
If he was to walk in, he would immediately grab your attention. He's a good-looking man. He was always well-dressed, well-mannered.
The 2 of them quickly hit it off.
I hate to be forward, but you mind joining me for dinner on Friday?
I like that.
He had a great resume. He also was a man of faith, which immediately resonated with Kendra.
Within a short period of time, Kendra was smitten, and then when she saw him preach, her love grew even bigger.
But God said we got to clean your filth. You still got some dirt on your nails. But even though you have dirt on your nails, he died. Yeah, before you got your engine running like new, he died. Yeah.
He was so charismatic.
His congregation loved and adored him.
He was able to breathe his own passion into the Word of God, and Kendra found that absolutely inspiring.
To Kendra, it felt like William could be the one, but she had no intention of racing to the altar.
Kendra's first marriage failed, and she was cautious about running into this one, so her and William took it slow.
This is a new person that you're introducing into your world, your children's world.
They dated more than 12 years.
I think game night went well with the kids.
It did. We should do it again sometime.
He was safe for her, and he was her nice guy. And he created that story for her.
In 2012, William finally popped the question.
Well, I was thinking about doing this somewhere a bit more romantic, but Kendra Jackson, will you marry me?
Yes.
In that moment, she was like, okay, this is the one. This is the man that God sent to me.
See?
Kendra thought all of her dreams were coming true.
But now, a few short years later, the couple's future has been hurled into doubt.
Instead of walking down the aisle, Kendra is barely clinging to life.
William was on the phone with 911 and told investigators that she shot herself in the head.
Damn it, Kendra, why you want to do this to me?
When first responders arrive on the scene, William leads them to the bedroom.
She's over here.
They find her collapsed on the floor in a pool of her own blood.
The first responders immediately jump into action.
The paramedics tried to apply first aid.
Every attempt was made to resuscitate her, but eventually it was clear that it was too late.
Kendra was dead.
For more than a decade, Macon pastor William Pounds had been Kendra Jackson's rock.
William was her handsome knight in shining armor. He was charismatic. He said all the right things.
She was planning a wedding to, a man that she loved.
Until a bullet to the head severed their bond forever.
The paramedics tried to apply first aid, but it became too late.
Kendra was dead.
When investigators from the Bibb County Sheriff's Office arrive on the scene, they step aside with Kendra's grieving fiancé.
Sir, I'm sorry for your loss. Do you think you're up to walking us through what happened?
Yeah. Yeah, I can do that.
Mr. Powell said it started off as a normal day. Him and Kendra and the kids had spent quality time together.
They all had dinner together, and then Kendra drove the kids over to their father's house.
Hurry back.
Kendra returned to the home around 10 p.m.
She came back. Him and her got into bed.
They are watching a basketball game and starting to discuss some of the details of their relationship.
Kendra started pressing him on a date for their marriage.
We've been engaged for a while now. I think it's time that we should start planning the wedding.
She wants her wedding because the whole world around her and William's relationship expects this to happen. Because that is the Christian thing to do.
He told her that he wasn't ready to get married, and she didn't respond well to that.
What do you mean you're not ready? We've been together for like 15 years.
He really loved Kendra, but after so many years, he had felt the relationship had run its course.
William tells investigators that when he broached the subject of ending their relationship, Kendra started to spiral.
All the years that she has invested in their relationship, she feels like she had wasted her time.
Kendra, calm down. We can talk.
Don't tell me to calm down!
He says that she flew into a rage.
Kendra grabbed the handgun off the dresser drawer.
And he thought that she would shoot him.
But instead, Kendra turned the gun on herself.
William told investigators that she shot herself in the left side of the head.
Oh my God!
He goes, attempts to resuscitate, he attempts to do whatever he can.
William said he hurried up and rushed to her side to control the bleeding as he dialed 911.
2, 3, 4.
To the detectives, William looks like a broken man.
He just explained he witnessed his fiance committing suicide, and that's not an easy thing to cope with.
Thank you.
With any death like this, they have to perform an investigation. But in the case of suicide, it's typically just a formality.
The crime scene has the appearance of a suicide. The victim is lying on the floor with a gun in close proximity. The blood is in the appropriate area. The gunshot appears to match up with the scenario provided by Mr. Pounds.
They did find an entry on the wall from the gunshot wound to her head.
But then investigators discover something else that piques their interest. A second bullet hole.
Looks like another bullet hole into the bed.
Sure does.
So this strikes investigators as odd because based on Williams' recitation of events, she only fired one bullet.
However, detectives know that a traumatic event can play tricks on a witness's mind.
When you have so much adrenaline and stuff rushing through your body, sometimes you can't account for what really happened during that time.
We might have what we call auditory exclusion, which really lessens a person's ability to hear in chaotic situations.
Also, with many suicide attempts, some may fire a practice shot before they work up the courage to turn the gun on themselves.
Having completed their preliminary examination, detectives hand the scene over to their forensic team.
Now, Bibb County investigators have to face the difficult decision of notifying Kendra's loved ones.
Kendra's teenage daughters are with their father.
The children, her ex-husband, are all shocked that Kendra had taken her own life.
Suicide? Are you sure?
It was disbelief, because there was no prior indication that Kendra would be susceptible to committing suicide.
There has to be another explanation. Our mom would never hurt herself.
The family did not believe that suicide was the cause of her death.
They're convinced there has to be more to this story.
Something's not right with it. And your gut. Your gut is always right.
Detectives in Macon, Georgia have learned that moments before Kendra Jackson allegedly committed suicide, her fiancé, William Pounds, called off their engagement.
He was starting to have some second thoughts about the future of them as a couple.
William said that she grabbed his .40 caliber pistol, shot herself in the head.
But now Kendra's loved ones are telling the investigators they find that story hard to believe.
There's no way our mom killed herself. They didn't believe that she would take her own life.
The family was adamant because it was outside of her character and also her faith.
What about warning signs? Did your mom seem depressed lately?
No, not at all.
Amen.
Kendra's daughters tell investigators they spent the previous day with their mother and William.
They said they didn't feel anything out of the ordinary.
And there was even cause to celebrate because Kendra's youngest daughter had just landed a new job.
They had dinner together to celebrate, and then she dropped them off to their father's house to spend the night.
Kendra made plans the next day to spend time with her daughter and go shopping. It just didn't line up.
Kendra's daughters also echo what William said in his statement. The couple wasn't in agreement about their impending wedding.
He just kept pushing back the wedding.
William and Kendra got engaged in 2012. They initially had planned on getting married in 2014. And when the date came around, William encouraged the couple to push it back even further.
Mr. Pound's explanation for the delay was financial issues.
The couple bickered about it. They had, small discussions. Nothing ever rose to the level of thinking that Kendra would take her life behind it.
By the end of the interview, investigators consider that Kendra Jackson's death may not be an open and shut case.
The fact that her loved ones, the people closest to Kendra, were so adamant that this could not be, that leads investigators to reassess the facts.
Could there be more to the story?
When detectives receive the results of Kendra's autopsy, even more questions rise to the surface.
Mr. Pounds told detectives that Kendra shot herself in the left side of the head. Well, the autopsy clearly disputed that. The evidence showed that she had shot herself in the right side.
Of course, adrenaline was running high. So maybe that was an explanation.
However, like the earlier finding that not one, but 2 bullets were fired inside the couple's bedroom, it's another inconsistency in William's version of events.
Had the chaos played tricks on William's memory, or is the story not adding up?
Police asked William to come into the station for a follow-up interview.
Appreciate you coming in on short notice.
Of course. Anything I can do to help.
William was cooperative and he seemed willing to assist in the investigation.
The night Kendra shot herself, tell me again what you saw.
He tells them again about their argument and how she got up and grabbed the gun from their dresser drawer.
William just concretely says she shot herself on the left side of her head. Now, the investigators know from coroner evidence that that is not true.
At that point, Mr. Pound's story started to unravel.
Your version of events doesn't line up with the evidence. There were 2 shots fired in their bedroom.
Well, I only remember 1 shot.
Did you alter the scene in any way?
No.
That's when investigators asked William a point-blank question.
Did you shoot Kendra? Absolutely not.
Despite the inconsistencies in his story, William maintains that Kendra's death was a suicide. But before investigators end the interview, he drops a bombshell.
He tells police officers that he was in another relationship.
Because I'm engaged.
He was engaged to someone else, as well as Kendra.
During an interview with police in Macon, Georgia, William Pounds has just made a stunning confession. The 47-year-old pastor tells detectives he called off his wedding with Kendra Jackson because he was engaged to another woman.
This information comes as a huge surprise to investigators.
Who's gonna believe that a pastor is engaged to 2 women? Not even believe. Who's gonna even suspect?
According to William, the other woman in his life is a police officer who lives 45 minutes away in Atlanta.
What's her name?
Sierra Brinkley.
It's a discovery that forces the investigators to rethink everything they thought they knew. Could Sierra Brinkley be involved in Kendra's death?
Maybe she wanted William all to, herself.
The fact that she was a police officer, she had access to a weapon that might help her facilitate this type of crime.
Sierra agrees to drive down from Atlanta to meet detectives at the Macon Police Department for an interview.
She confirms that yes, she and William, they are engaged.
She reveals to the detectives that they had actually been together for over 10 years.
You said 10 years?
That's right.
I mean, that was like wow.
Double life. That's my first thoughts. That's a double life.
Imagine having two fully involved relationships happening an hour away from each other for 10 years. The level of coordination, level of secrecy that you must maintain.
You're trying to satisfy two people. You're trying to take care of two homes.
As an investigator, when it comes to Sierra, we want to look, when did she become aware that Kendra existed? Where was she at the time this incident happened?
According to Sierra, Kendra's existence was no secret.
What William had told Sierra is that Kendra was an ex, that they had been broken up, separated for years.
I thought that was the truth up until like a few weeks ago.
One day, Sierra decided to drive down to Macon and surprise William at his house.
When Sierra popped up at William's house unannounced, Kendra's there.
Sierra asked her, you know, like, what are you doing here?
What do you mean, what am I doing here? Who the hell are you?
Kendra held up her finger with a wedding ring on it and said that they was engaged to get married.
So, what did you do next?
I confronted William.
Wait, no. Go upstairs. I'll handle this. Go upstairs.
What is going on?
Let me explain.
William promises to Sierra that things are over with Kendra.
Look, she just came over to pick up some stuff. Our relationship, it's over. Come on. Don't give me that look. You're my only girl and my soon-to-be wife. Okay?
He says they can start preparing for their marriage by going to premarital counseling, hopefully to resolve some of the issues around honesty and fidelity.
And you agreed to go to counseling?
Yes, I did.
They were due to be married on June 12th, and that was the exact same date that Kendra died.
But as investigators know, instead of walking down the aisle with Sierra, William spent that evening with Kendra.
When she found out that William hadn't ended things with Kendra, Sierra could have flown into a jealous rage.
Did you do it and now William is covering up for you?
When investigators pose that question to Sierra, she immediately denies any involvement in Kendra's death.
Of course, Sierra says no. The last time she was even at William's house was on June 5th, a full week before the incident happened.
As police work on verifying Sierra's statement, detectives receive the completed report from the CSI technicians who processed William's home. And their findings are eye-opening.
When detectives had initially walked through the crime scene, they noticed a bullet hole in the wall, but despite exhaustive searching, the CSI was not able to recover the bullet.
What happened to that bullet that was in there, and why was it pried out of the wall?
The forensic team also failed to recover the second bullet that went through the mattress, or either shell casings.
A closer examination of the comforter and mattress revealed more alarming evidence.
They could tell by the way that the bullet had passed through the comforter that the comforter had been moved after the shots were fired. The bed had apparently been remade in an effort to conceal the bullet hole in the mattress and the comforter and the sheets.
Somebody had tampered with the scene.
The trajectory of the bullet that killed Kendra raises an even bigger red flag.
There was no way that Kendra was standing when she allegedly shot herself in the head. The evidence points to her being on the ground
Based on these new findings, investigators feel confident that Kendra was murdered.
These are no longer discrepancies that you can attribute to faulty memory. So police believe that William has been lying. He's trying to protect himself or his other woman.
When investigators listen to the 911 call William made on the night of Kendra's death, they make yet another chilling discovery.
You still there with me? Sir?
Yes, ma'am. I'm here.
They noticed that Mr. Pounds muted his end of the call 3 to 4 times.
Hey, partner?
Why would a person in the process of administering first aid CPR mute his call?
1, 2, 3. You still there with me? Sir?
Yes, ma'am.
Wait, you hear that?
Play that back.
Sir?
Yes, ma'am.
When he unmuted the phone call, you can hear the toilet flushing in the background.
If you are doing CPR, then how are we hearing the flush? What's really going on?
As Macon investigators listen to the 911 call local pastor William Pounds made on the night he alleges his fiancée Kendra Jackson committed suicide, they notice a curious noise in the background.
You still there with me? Sir?
Yes, ma'am.
You can hear the toilet flushing in the background.
They suspect that toilet flushing noise could actually be William flushing down the bullet and the shell casings.
When detectives follow up with the paramedics who responded that night, they poke even more holes in William's story.
William told 911 operators that he performed CPR on Kendra before first responders arrived. But first responders, they said there was no sign of blood on William's clothes, except for a couple tiny specks on his pants.
With the amount of blood on the scene, his hands and his lower shirt should have been covered in blood.
The first responders go on to say that William told them something else in those first frantic minutes.
Their story they got from Mr. Pounds was different than the story that Mr. Pounds told the detective.
He said that he was downstairs and then he heard the gunshot go off upstairs, and then that's when he ran upstairs.
William told them that he had to kick the door in order to get to Kendra. There was no evidence that the door had been kicked in at all.
As red flags pile up, detectives also start to hear from Kendra's closest confidants. They all agree that her decade-plus relationship with William was nothing short of a roller coaster.
Kendra's friends explained to investigators that William was not this perfect fiancé, perfect man.
William was a liar, he was a manipulator.
He knew he was good looking and he had the gift of gab. I think he felt as though that was a calling card for him to get into any door he wanted to.
She had caught him cheating on multiple occasions.
Who is this?
Kendra.
Who is she? Who is this? What are you doing?
I'm sorry, okay? You know how much I love you. It won't happen again.
To their dismay, friends say Kendra stayed with William despite his philandering behavior.
Even when she knew it was broken, she loved enough to be able, I can put it back together, I can fix it. She really believed that.
Jesus reminds us to forgive.
It's almost like, you know, when somebody's in a Ponzi scam and they keep putting their money into it, and you don't want to tell them not to, but you kind of want to take their checking account. But she kept depositing and he kept taking.
She's already experienced divorce. So maybe Kendra was thinking, I don't want to start over.
All right.
Friends say the couple's engagement offered Kendra a fleeting moment of happiness.
She was proud of her ring, but I think that's all she had, was that ring. It was a shallow happiness.
They would discuss a wedding date, and he would move it or come up with some type of excuse.
Anything that he said was a lie. All of it was a lie. And every day it was killing her. Every day it was taking more of Kendra from Kendra. And she loved so hard that she put blinders on and couldn't even see that she was being stripped from herself.
However, in the past month, friends say Kendra had stopped wearing her engagement ring.
After Kendra found out about Sierra, that felt like the last straw.
Now, not only have you been played by a fool, but you've been playing the fool.
Who are you? Kendra was done at this point.
What's going on?
In the course of their interviews, detectives learned that William's affair with Sierra Brinkley wasn't the only one.
The investigation reveals that William had been seen about 5 separate women.
He was stringing them all along, telling each of them that they were the love of his life.
It was disgusting.
When authorities received Sierra Brinkley's phone records, William's last defense finally crumbles.
She was in Atlanta. She was nowhere near Macon when this took place.
She was not at the scene of the crime when it happened.
On August 21st, 2015, Bibb County Sheriff's investigators charged William Pounds with malice murder, felony murder, and aggravated assault.
William was arrested for Kendra's murder, and he was calm and maintained his innocence.
The family finally has this moment where they can breathe and they have a sense of relief.
But that feeling of relief doesn't last long.
His bond was $500,000. That's a lot. But he reached out to his congregation.
On September 15th, at William's bond hearing, his congregation shows up and rallies around him.
Pastors in the faith community are revered because they are delivering the word of God every week. People truly believe they are instruments of the divine. And so the initial reaction for a lot of people is denial.
They was like, no, he didn't do this. And they went ahead and bonded him out.
Within weeks of his arrest, William is back on the street as a free man.
For Kendra's loved ones, it's an ominous sign of things to come.
It just goes to show just how powerful he is. He feels invincible.
It's almost like he's gotten away with it. He was so charismatic. He tricked them, too.
If I never had a problem, if I never had conflict,
He is the instrument of God. They can't let God go to jail.
then I wouldn't know how to go to the manufacturer.
By the fall of 2015, Macon police have charged Kendra Jackson's fiancé, William Pounds, with killing her and staging it as a suicide.
William is a respected, beloved pastor, so the congregation is quick to rally money to get him released.
They felt like he was wrongfully accused.
They paid his bond and allowed him to get back out on the street.
Backed by a devoted flock of believers, prosecutors feel that William's conviction is no sure thing.
It can be hard to overcome a defendant's image, especially when someone is seen upright and moral.
In the eyes of the public, William Pounds is a pillar in his community. And so it's going to be difficult to convince a jury that he's actually a liar, cheater, and a murderer.
But as the trial date approaches, prosecutors receive a helping hand from an unexpected source: William himself.
As a condition of his bond, Mr. Pounds had to wear an ankle monitor so his whereabouts could be monitored. He had restrictions.
He's approved to go to places that, a normal person would need to go. The doctor's office, the grocery store, his home.
However, the powerful pastor has no intention of following the rules.
He was breaking his bond conditions. He was drinking, he was going out to parties like nothing never happened. Kendra's gone, this sweetheart. These two daughters now don't have a mother. So many people affected. And the nerve of him to celebrate anything ever again in life.
He was clearly violating the conditions of his bond, and he was rearrested.
This is when the congregation started to realize that this is not the church-going man that they all thought he was.
Just to see that many people being manipulated at one time, it's just evil. I felt bad for the people.
When William's trial begins in October 2017, he still remains confident that his pious image will carry him through to a not guilty verdict.
William enters the courtroom with a Bible in his hand.
He's still keeping up with this persona that he's created.
But prosecutors aren't having it.
They contend that William's mountain of lies can prove that he's the killer.
Prosecutors tell the jury that on the night of June 12, 2015, William and Kendra got into an argument.
I noticed you ain't been wearing that ring I gave you.
You damn right I haven't.
Based on the statements from her friends, prosecutors believe that Kendra was done with William.
Why would I wear the ring of a man who's engaged to another woman?
As simmering resentments bubbled to the surface, the couple's argument intensified.
Prosecutors believe that Kendra, having seen William's web of lies firsthand, was going to expose him for a fraud, a liar, a manipulator.
That's right. I'm going to tell the entire congregation that their pastor is a damn hypocrite.
You know what?
And so instead of taking responsibility for his actions, investigators say that he opted to silence her altogether.
What are you going to tell them?
What are you doing?
What are you going to tell them?
What are you doing?
I'm not doing anything. Where are you going?
William took his military-issued pistol and fired 2 shots. One that went through the bed and another that went through Kendra's head.
Once Kendra was dead, Mr. Pounds immediately tried to stage the scene so it appeared that Kendra had committed suicide. Mr. Pounds retrieved the bullet from the wall, retrieved the casing from the floor. He took both items into the bathroom and flushed them down the toilet.
Once the jury retires to deliberate, it doesn't take them long to return with their verdict.
William Pounds was found guilty of malice murder, felony murder, and aggravated assault.
William was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole.
It's a victory for the dedicated investigators who worked tirelessly to bring William to justice. But for Kendra's loved ones, the conviction falls short of healing their wounds.
I don't think there's any amount of time that he could do to repair the pain and the hurt and the brokenness that doesn't bring Kendra back.
It takes a unique kind of manipulator to prey on so many women.
He did it for arrogance. He did it for nothing. He did it because he felt as though he could get away with it.
While nothing can replace what Kendra's loved ones lost, her legacy continues to inspire them to this day.
Kendra taught me that regardless of what happens, you hold your head high. And when everything is said and done, your love and your life will speak for itself.
On a late May evening in 2014, Isla Vista felt like any other college town on the edge of celebration. The air was warm in a way that only coastal California can deliver, carrying the faint salt of the Pacific and the restless energy of students who could already taste summer freedom. Porch lights glowed outside cramped apartment complexes, music drifted from open windows, and groups of young people moved through the streets in loose clusters, laughing, arguing, planning the night ahead. Nothing about the scene suggested that within minutes, this small stretch of Santa Barbara County would become the center of one of the most shocking acts of mass violence in recent American history. At approximately 9:30 p.m., an apartment door in the quieter residential section of Isla Vista closed behind a young man who had spent years building a private world of resentment. Inside that apartment, 3 young lives were already ending in silence, unseen by the outside world. The room itself would later be described by investigators as disturbingly ordinary in appearance, a space filled with the remnants of student life, yet frozen in a moment of sudden, irreversible brutality. There were no dramatic signs from the outside, no warnings visible to neighbors, no indication that the night had already taken a devastating turn behind closed walls. That young man stepped back into the world carrying something far heavier than his slight frame suggested. What followed over the next several hours would not unfold as a chaotic blur, but as something chillingly intentional, almost methodical in its progression. Isla Vista, with its dense population of students, narrow streets, and late-night movement, would become the stage for a sequence of encounters that no one walking those sidewalks that night could have anticipated. To understand the gravity of what happened, one must first understand the invisible architecture that had been forming long before that evening. The individual at the center of this case, Elliot Rodger, was not unknown to those closest to him. He was known in fragments, in inconsistencies, in the way people sometimes know someone who is physically present but emotionally distant. Born in 1991 in London and raised in the United States, he grew up within a life of relative comfort, surrounded by privilege that, from the outside, seemed to promise stability. Yet beneath that surface, there was a growing internal narrative that no one fully saw in its entirety until it was too late. Rodger's early life was marked by social difficulty. Teachers and peers often described him as quiet, withdrawn, and uncomfortable in group settings. While other children moved through the natural turbulence of adolescence with varying degrees of adaptation, he appeared increasingly disconnected from the rhythms of social interaction. As he grew older, this disconnection did not fade. Instead, it deepened into isolation, shaping the way he interpreted every interaction, every rejection, every perceived slight. By his late teens and early 20s, Rodger had retreated further into digital spaces. The internet became both refuge and reinforcement, a place where frustration could be validated and resentment could find structure. Within this environment, he began to construct a worldview in which his personal disappointments were not isolated experiences, but evidence of a larger, more systematic injustice. Over time, this perception hardened into certainty. Yet on the outside, life in Isla Vista that night continued without interruption. Students moved between parties, bicycles leaned against walls, and the ocean wind carried the sound of distant laughter across intersections. The contrast between the ordinary flow of life and the hidden violence already unfolding was absolute. That tension, between normality and catastrophe, is what makes what followed so difficult to comprehend even in hindsight. Shortly after leaving the apartment, Rodger moved through the streets in a vehicle, initiating what would later be reconstructed as a sequence of targeted and random attacks. The first phase of violence had already occurred behind closed doors, but the second phase would spill into public space, where strangers, unaware of any danger, crossed paths with him in the most ordinary of circumstances. Pedestrians walking home, students gathered outside buildings, individuals engaged in the simple act of existing in shared space became part of a rapidly escalating series of encounters. What is most striking about the early moments of the incident is not only the brutality itself, but the randomness of proximity. Isla Vista is a place defined by closeness, where apartment buildings sit tightly packed, where sidewalks narrow, and where people frequently move through shared corridors of space. On that night, that density became a factor in how quickly fear spread. Word traveled faster than official warnings. People began running before they fully understood what they were running from. Emergency calls started to accumulate within minutes. At first, they were fragmented, uncertain descriptions that did not yet form a coherent picture. A loud disturbance. A possible shooting. Someone injured near a street corner. Each report added another piece to a puzzle that responders were still trying to assemble in real time. Law enforcement units began moving into the area, but the situation was still evolving faster than it could be contained. As the night progressed, the violence escalated in scope and reach. What had begun in private had now become public chaos. The distinction between safe and unsafe space collapsed almost entirely within the small geographic area of Isla Vista. Students who had been laughing moments earlier found themselves locking doors, hiding in rooms, or fleeing in whatever direction seemed most likely to lead away from danger. At the center of this unfolding crisis, Roger continued moving through the environment, interacting with the world in a way that would later be described by investigators as both erratic and purposeful. The exact sequence of his movements would take time to reconstruct, but what became clear early on was that the night was not a random explosion of violence, but a progression of actions that followed a personal logic, however distorted that logic may have been. As police units converged on the area, the urgency of the response intensified. Officers navigated streets filled with confusion, uncertain which reports were accurate, and which were rumors spreading faster than facts could be confirmed. Helicopters began circling above, their searchlights cutting through the night air, scanning for movement below. Residents remained inside, listening to distant sirens that seemed to multiply rather than approach resolution. What makes this moment particularly haunting in retrospect is how ordinary it all still appeared from certain vantage points. In some parts of Isla Vista, music continued playing. In others, people were only beginning to realize that something deeply wrong was unfolding nearby. This uneven awareness created a fragmented reality, where some individuals were fully immersed in crisis while others remained only partially informed until the situation directly reached them. By the time the full scale of the incident became clear, 6 people would be dead and more than 10 others injured. The number alone, however, does not capture the disorientation of that night, the way time seemed to bend under the weight of unfolding events, or the sudden rupture in the sense of safety that had previously defined the community. The final phase of the night ended not with resolution in the traditional sense, but with collapse. As law enforcement closed in and the situation reached its conclusion, the individual at the center of the case was found deceased, bringing an end to the immediate threat, but not to the questions that would follow. In the hours afterward, Isla Vista remained locked in a state of disbelief, as emergency responders, investigators, and residents began to piece together what had just occurred. But even in those early moments, before details were fully confirmed, one reality had already taken hold. This was not an incident that could be understood through a single explanation, or reduced to a simple narrative of sudden violence. It was the result of a long, hidden accumulation of internal and external forces, converging in a single night that transformed an ordinary college town into the site of lasting trauma. And as dawn approached over Isla Vista, revealing streets still marked by confusion and loss, the question that lingered was not only what had happened, but how so many signs, so many fragments of warning, had existed in plain sight, without ever forming a barrier strong enough to prevent the night from unfolding as it did. Isla Vista is a place that exists in contradiction to itself. On maps, it is a small coastal community in Santa Barbara County, California, but in reality it behaves more like a temporary city, one that expands and contracts with the academic calendar. During the school year, it is crowded, restless, and alive with student energy. During breaks, it becomes quieter, almost hollow, as if the buildings are exhaling after months of holding too many lives at once. In 2014, the rhythm of Isla Vista was shaped almost entirely by the presence of students from the nearby University of California, Santa Barbara. The campus itself sits just a short distance away, separated from the residential streets only by open space and winding roads. That proximity defines everything about life in Isla Vista. There is no clear boundary between university and neighborhood, between academic life and private life, between celebration and exhaustion. Everything blends together in a continuous flow of movement and noise. The housing in Isla Vista reflects its transient nature. Apartments are small, densely packed, and often shared by groups of students who are learning not only their academic subjects, but also the limits of cohabitation, responsibility, and independence. Walls are thin enough that conversations travel between rooms. Windows are often left open not for ventilation, but because privacy is already an abstract concept in such close quarters. It is a place where individuality exists, but always in relation to others nearby. On weekends, the streets fill with movement. Students walk between parties, gather in front of apartments, or sit on sidewalks as music spills into the night air. There is a sense of constant transition, as if no one is ever fully staying in one place for very long. Even those who are resting are only temporarily paused before the next gathering, the next conversation, the next decision to move somewhere else. This constant motion creates a unique kind of social environment. People recognize each other not through deep familiarity, but through repeated proximity. A face seen at one party might reappear at another. A brief conversation on a sidewalk might become a nod of recognition days later. Relationships are often fluid, forming and dissolving quickly, shaped more by circumstance than by long-term continuity. Yet beneath this apparent openness, there are also invisible boundaries. Social groups form naturally, often based on shared interests, backgrounds, or simply timing. For someone who does not easily fit into these patterns, the experience of Isla Vista can feel overwhelming. The density of social interaction, combined with the expectation of ease and connection, can intensify feelings of isolation rather than reduce them. In 2014, these dynamics were already well established. Isla Vista was not a new environment. It had seen years of similar cycles, each generation of students bringing their own version of the same rhythm. But what made it significant in the context of what would later occur was not any single characteristic, but the combination of proximity, density, and youth. It was a place where emotional highs and lows were amplified simply by the closeness of everything and everyone. The weather on the California coast often reinforces this sense of emotional intensity. Days are bright, skies are wide, and the ocean is always nearby, visible or implied through the air. On the surface, this creates an atmosphere that feels open and inviting. But for individuals experiencing internal distress, that same brightness can feel dissonant, as if the external world is insisting on a happiness that does not match internal reality. Within this environment, students navigate a complex mix of academic pressure, social expectations, and personal development. Many are living away from home for the first time, experimenting with independence while still carrying the emotional structures of adolescence. Mistakes are common, and so is growth, but not always at the same pace for everyone. It is within this type of environment that isolation can become particularly difficult to recognize. Because everyone appears to be surrounded by people, loneliness is often invisible. A person sitting alone in a crowded room does not immediately stand out. Someone walking through a party, without engaging deeply in conversation, might simply be assumed to be independent rather than disconnected. In the years leading up to 2014, Elliot Rodger existed within this same geographical and social space, but not within its emotional center. He lived physically close to the rhythms of Isla Vista, yet remained psychologically separate from them. While others moved through shared experiences, he observed from the margins, interpreting social interactions through a lens that increasingly reinforced his sense of exclusion. Rodger's presence in Isla Vista was not unusual in a demographic sense. Many students and residents experienced difficulty adjusting to the social environment. What made his situation distinct was not visibility, but invisibility in terms of intervention. His struggles were not unknown in an absolute sense, but they did not translate into effective engagement or sustained response from those around him. To understand this gap, it is necessary to understand how communities like Isla Vista process behavior that falls outside the norm. In a place defined by constant social activity, withdrawal can sometimes be mistaken for preference. A student who does not attend gatherings may simply be seen as private. A person who avoids repeated interaction may be interpreted as independent rather than isolated. The assumptions are often benign, but they can obscure deeper patterns. At the same time, Roger's internal world was becoming increasingly structured around perception rather than interaction. His understanding of others was shaped less by direct communication and more by interpretation, often filtered through online environments, where ideas can intensify without immediate challenge. Over time, this created a feedback loop in which his beliefs about exclusion became more rigid, even as his opportunities for real-world correction diminished. Isla Vista, in this sense, functioned as both physical reality and symbolic contrast. It represented everything he felt separated from: social ease, romantic connection, visible belonging. The more he observed it from the outside, the more it appeared to confirm his internal narrative. The environment itself did not change, but his interpretation of it became increasingly fixed. Meanwhile, life in Isla Vista continued its normal cycles. Students worried about exams, relationships formed and ended, roommates argued over small domestic issues, and nights passed in a blur of shared experiences. From the outside, nothing suggested an approaching rupture. The community was not aware that within its boundaries, an individual was constructing a private framework of grievance that would eventually intersect with public space in a devastating way. Law enforcement presence in Isla Vista before 2014 was typical for a college town of its size and density. Officers managed routine incidents related to noise, alcohol, and minor disturbances. The structure was designed for moderation, not for anticipating large-scale violence. This is not unique to Isla Vista, but it becomes significant in hindsight when examining how systems respond to low-frequency, high-impact events. In communities like this, prevention often depends on visible indicators. Behavior must cross a threshold before it becomes actionable. The challenge arises when warning signs exist in fragmented forms, distributed across time, space, and context, never fully coalescing into a single report that demands intervention. In Roger's case, those fragments existed, but they did not align in a way that triggered decisive action. At the same time, the broader cultural environment was undergoing its own shifts. Discussions around mental health, social isolation, and online radicalization were present, but not yet fully integrated into preventive frameworks. The language existed, but the mechanisms for early response were still developing. This gap between awareness and action would later become a central focus in the aftermath of the tragedy. Isla Vista itself, however, remained largely unaware of these larger structural issues. For most residents, life was immediate and local. Concerns were personal, not systemic. The idea that something catastrophic could emerge from within such a familiar environment was not part of daily perception. And yet, that is precisely what makes the setting so important to understanding what followed. Isla Vista was not an isolated or extreme environment. It was ordinary in its structure, familiar in its rhythms, and representative of many similar college communities across the United States. It was a place designed for youth, transition, and social density, not for anticipating the convergence of prolonged internal distress and sudden external violence. On the surface, everything functioned as expected. Beneath that surface, however, individual experiences were diverging in ways that were not immediately visible. Some people were building connections. Others were drifting away from them. Most were somewhere in between, moving through the predictable instability of early adulthood. In that complexity, nothing stood out enough to demand attention, until the night when everything changed. In every act of mass violence, there is a moment when statistics stop being numbers and become human beings again. In Isla Vista, that transformation did not happen all at once. It happened slowly, unevenly, as the names and lives of those affected began to surface through police reports, family statements, and the painful process of identification. Before that, in the immediate aftermath, everything was still confusion, broken fragments of information moving through emergency channels and whispered conversations, none of them yet forming a complete picture of what had been lost. 6 people were killed that night. Each of them existed in a world far larger than the final moments that brought their names into public awareness. They had routines, relationships, ambitions that stretched beyond Isla Vista, beyond college life, beyond the boundaries of that single evening. To understand the weight of what happened, it is necessary to step away from the abstraction of victims and move closer to the reality that they were individuals whose lives had meaning long before they were ever connected to tragedy. Among them were students who had been living ordinary lives in the dense, shared environment of Isla Vista. Some were in their apartments when the violence began, spaces that should have represented safety and familiarity. Others were in the wrong place at the wrong time, moving through streets that, only minutes earlier, had felt no different from any other night in a college town. The randomness of proximity is one of the most difficult aspects of this case to comprehend, because it strips away the illusion that danger always follows a pattern. One of the earliest confirmed victims was Christopher Michaels Martinez. He was a student at the University of California, Santa Barbara, known among peers as someone engaged in his studies and connected to campus life. On that evening, he was near a deli in Isla Vista when he encountered the unfolding violence. In a matter of moments, an ordinary stop in an ordinary place became the final chapter of his life. Those who knew him later described a young man with humor, warmth, and a presence that made him part of the fabric of his community. His absence would later be felt not as a distant statistic, but as a silence in spaces where his voice had once naturally belonged. The other victims included Roger's 3 roommates, individuals who had shared physical space with him in the most intimate and routine sense of daily life. These were people who had experienced the small negotiations of shared living, schedules, meals, conversations in hallways, the unremarkable friction that comes with cohabitation. In many ways, they represented the closest possible proximity to him in both geography and circumstance. Their deaths, occurring within the apartment at the beginning of the incident, added a layer of intimacy to the tragedy that would later haunt the investigation. Unlike the randomness of later encounters, this first act of violence unfolded in a private environment, behind closed doors, within a space that should have been defined by trust, or at least neutrality. It marked the beginning of a night that moved from interior to exterior, from hidden to visible, from contained to widespread. The details of their final moments were reconstructed later through forensic investigation rather than witnessed accounts, but what remained consistent was the sense that they were taken without warning. There was no opportunity for understanding, no chance for escape, only the sudden collapse of ordinary time into something irreversible. For families, the absence of final communication would become one of the most painful aspects of the aftermath, leaving unanswered questions that could never be resolved. Beyond these individuals, other victims were injured during the sequence of events that followed. Some were students walking through Isla Vista's narrow streets, others were near intersections where movement was dense and visibility limited. Each encounter lasted only seconds, but each second carried consequences that would extend far beyond that night. The randomness of selection meant that no behavioral pattern could be identified among those affected. They were not connected by action, intention, or relationship to the perpetrator. They were connected only by presence. In the hours after the attack, hospitals in the region became centers of urgency and emotional shock. Medical staff worked under conditions of extreme pressure, treating injuries while simultaneously receiving fragments of information about what had occurred outside their walls. Families gathered in waiting rooms, many unaware of whether their loved ones were safe, injured, or already gone. The uncertainty itself became a form of suffering, stretching time into something unbearable. As identification processes began, the names of the deceased slowly emerged into public awareness. With each name, the scale of loss became more personal. Community members began to recognize faces from classrooms, social spaces, and everyday encounters. Isla Vista, which had once been defined by constant movement and social density, began to contract inward emotionally, as if the entire community was processing a collective shock. What makes the human dimension of this case so difficult to fully capture is the way ordinary life continues to echo after it has been interrupted. Friends of the victims spoke about unfinished conversations, future plans that were never realized, small details that suddenly took on new weight in retrospect. A message left unread. A meeting planned for the next day. A routine interaction that, at the time, seemed insignificant, but later became deeply meaningful in memory. In the days following the tragedy, vigils formed across Isla Vista and the surrounding campus. Students gathered in silence, candles flickering in coastal wind, faces illuminated by grief and disbelief. These gatherings were not just expressions of mourning, but attempts to reassemble a sense of community that had been fractured in a single night. People stood together without needing words, sharing a space defined by absence rather than presence. Families of the victims faced a different kind of reality, one that extended beyond public mourning into private, lifelong adjustment. The process of receiving official confirmation, arranging memorials, and confronting media attention created layers of emotional complexity that could not be easily separated. In interviews and statements, many spoke not only of loss, but of the challenge of reconciling memory with the suddenness of absence. One of the most persistent themes in these reflections was the unpredictability of life in shared environments like Isla Vista. Parents and relatives struggled with the idea that their loved ones had been in a place that felt familiar, social, and generally safe, yet had become the site of unimaginable violence in a matter of minutes. That contradiction became part of the broader public conversation in the weeks that followed. As details of the incident became clearer, attention began to shift not only toward what had happened, but toward the broader conditions that made it possible for such a convergence of events to occur. The victims, in this evolving narrative, were no longer only individuals in a single case. They became symbols in discussions about safety, community design, mental health awareness, and the limits of prevention in unpredictable situations. Yet even as those larger conversations developed, the human reality remained unchanged. Each of the 6 lives lost represented a unique trajectory that had been interrupted without warning. No amount of analysis could reverse that fact, and no structural explanation could fully contain the emotional impact carried by those who knew them personally. In the quiet moments after the public attention began to fade, what remained were memories held by friends, families, and communities. These memories did not follow a single narrative structure. They existed in fragments, laughter in shared spaces, conversations that seemed ordinary at the time, photographs taken long before the night of the incident. Together, they formed a collective attempt to preserve identity in the face of sudden erasure. Isla Vista itself would eventually return to its normal rhythm of student life, as all places of transition eventually do. But beneath that surface rhythm, the memory of those lost remained embedded in the community's awareness. The streets where it happened continued to be walked. The buildings where it began continued to be lived in. Yet nothing within that environment could remain entirely unchanged by what had occurred. The victims of that night are often discussed in the context of a larger event, but their individual lives resist being fully absorbed into that narrative. They remain distinct, separate from the circumstances of their deaths. And in remembering them, the focus inevitably returns to something simple and profound: that each of them was a person whose existence mattered long before it was interrupted, and whose absence continues to be felt in ways that statistics can never fully express. By the time the evening fully settled over Isla Vista on May 23, 2014, the transition from normality to catastrophe had already begun, even if most people in the community were still unaware of it. Nightlife continued in its familiar patterns, but beneath that surface movement, something had already fractured the expected order of the night. The first acts of violence had taken place behind closed doors, unseen by the wider world, and what followed would carry that hidden rupture outward into public space. The apartment where the initial killings occurred was part of a dense cluster of student housing, the kind of place where sounds from one unit often blend into another, where footsteps in hallways are rarely given a second thought. Inside, however, a sequence of events unfolded that would later be reconstructed through investigation rather than witnessed directly. 3 lives ended there before the outside world had any reason to suspect what had already begun. When Elliot Rodger left that apartment, he did so with a sense of movement that appeared calm to any observer who might have briefly crossed his path. There was no immediate visual indication of what had just occurred. Isla Vista, with its constant flow of students moving between homes, parties, and sidewalks, did not yet register any disruption. The night still felt open, continuous, uninterrupted. In the early phase of what would become a broader attack, Rodger moved through the area in a vehicle. The streets of Isla Vista at night are narrow and heavily populated, especially during weekends and late spring evenings. People walk in groups, cross streets without hesitation, and gather in front of apartment buildings where conversations spill into public space. It is a setting defined by proximity, where anonymity and familiarity coexist in uneasy balance. At a certain point along this movement, the violence transitioned from private to public. The first victims encountered outside the apartment were individuals who had no connection to Rodger, no awareness of his presence, and no reason to anticipate danger. They were part of the ordinary fabric of the night, walking, talking, existing within the shared space of the community. The suddenness of what occurred left no room for interpretation in the moment it happened. The sound of the first emergency calls began to enter dispatch channels shortly after. At first, the reports were fragmented and uncertain. Witnesses described something happening nearby, but the details did not yet align into a clear picture. In environments like Isla Vista, where parties and noise are common, initial confusion is not unusual. But this confusion quickly began to shift as more calls arrived in rapid succession, each adding a sharper edge to the unfolding situation. Law enforcement units began to move toward the area without full knowledge of what they were approaching. Officers responded to reports that were still forming in real time, navigating streets that were becoming increasingly chaotic. The difficulty in those early minutes was not only locating the source of danger, but understanding its scale. Nothing in the initial information suggested a single, continuous event. Instead, it appeared as scattered incidents occurring within a small geographic radius. As Rodger continued moving through Isla Vista, the environment around him changed rapidly. What had begun as a typical night for residents was now shifting into something fragmented and unstable. People who had been walking moments earlier began to run. Conversations broke off mid-sentence. Doors closed and locked as awareness spread unevenly through the community. The speed of information traveling through social networks, phones, and word of mouth meant that fear often arrived before clarity. In several locations, individuals encountered the unfolding violence without understanding its context. The proximity of events created a sense of unpredictability that made every sound, every passing vehicle, every movement outside feel potentially significant. In dense residential areas, perception becomes heightened under stress, and the inability to distinguish between rumor and reality contributes to a growing sense of disorientation. Emergency responders face the challenge of navigating this shifting landscape. Reports continued to come in, but they did not form a single coherent trajectory at first. Instead, they suggested multiple points of concern within a relatively small area. This pattern required rapid adaptation, as officers attempted to identify whether they were dealing with isolated incidents or a coordinated sequence. At the same time, the helicopter presence above Isla Vista began to expand. From above, the layout of the community revealed clusters of activity, movement patterns that suggested something beyond ordinary disturbance. Searchlights swept across rooftops, streets, and open spaces, attempting to locate the source of reported danger. For residents on the ground, these lights became part of the psychological intensity of the moment, signaling that the situation had escalated beyond local containment. As the night progressed, Rogers' movements intersected with additional individuals in public spaces. These encounters were brief, often lasting only moments, but they carried irreversible consequences. The randomness of these interactions meant that there was no consistent profile among those affected. They were students, residents, pedestrians, each engaged in ordinary nighttime activity. The sudden intrusion of violence into these moments created a rupture that was both immediate and incomprehensible. Within minutes, Isla Vista began to transform from a social environment into an active emergency zone. Police vehicles converged from multiple directions, sirens cutting through the coastal night air. Officers began establishing a perimeter, while simultaneously attempting to respond to reports still emerging from within the area. Communication between units became critical, as information needed to be constantly updated in real time. For residents, the experience of those moments varied depending on proximity. Some were directly exposed to danger, while others were only aware through indirect signals such as sirens, messages, or the movement of people running through streets. This uneven distribution of information created a layered experience of fear, where understanding lagged behind reality. Inside apartments, students attempted to process incomplete information. Phones became primary sources of connection to the outside world, but they also contributed to uncertainty, as messages were often fragmented or contradictory. Social media platforms began to fill with speculation, warnings, and confusion, reflecting the lack of clear official communication in the earliest phase of the response. As officers narrowed their focus, the situation began to coalesce into a more defined incident. The realization that multiple attacks were connected rather than separate events changed the urgency and direction of the response. Resources were redirected, and coordination between units intensified. The objective shifted from investigation to immediate containment. During this period, Rogers' final movements were still unfolding within the same geographic area. The exact sequence of his actions would later be reconstructed through evidence and testimony, but at the time, responders were working without full visibility. The challenge was not only locating him, but anticipating where he might appear next within a dense and partially obscured environment. The final phase of the incident occurred as law enforcement closed in on his location. The convergence of police presence, combined with the ongoing uncertainty of the situation, created a rapidly tightening perimeter. Isla Vista, already compressed by geography and population density, became even more constrained under emergency conditions. When the situation reached its conclusion, the immediate threat ended, but the environment remained unstable. Officers continued to secure areas, assist victims, and gather information while the broader community attempted to understand what had just taken place. The transition from active threat to aftermath was not immediate. It unfolded gradually as clarity replaced confusion. In the hours that followed, the scale of the incident became fully apparent. The number of casualties, the range of locations involved, and the speed at which events had unfolded contributed to a sense of collective shock. Isla Vista, usually defined by social energy and student life, was now defined by emergency response and investigation. What made the incident particularly difficult to process was its combination of familiarity and disruption. The setting was not an unfamiliar or isolated place. It was a typical college environment, recognizable to many who have experienced similar communities. That familiarity made the violence more difficult to separate from everyday reality. As dawn approached, the streets that had been filled with movement and noise the night before were now marked by silence, police presence, and the early stages of forensic examination. The contrast between the previous evening and the morning that followed was absolute. Isla Vista had not changed in structure, but its meaning had shifted in a way that would not be easily reversed. The incident, in its totality, was not only a sequence of violent acts, but also a rupture in the assumed stability of a shared environment. It revealed how quickly ordinary spaces can become sites of crisis when multiple trajectories intersect in unexpected ways. And in the aftermath, the question that remained was not only how it happened, but how such a transformation could occur within a place so deeply embedded in everyday life. When the first officers entered Isla Vista in the early moments of the response, they were stepping into a situation that was still forming in real time. The streets were not yet fully defined by what had happened, but by what people believed might be happening. Confusion moved faster than confirmation. Calls continued to arrive, each one adding pressure, but not always clarity. The challenge for responders was not simply to locate a single incident, but to understand whether they were dealing with one connected sequence, or multiple unrelated emergencies occurring within the same dense environment. The first confirmed scene was inside the apartment where the initial killings had taken place. From the outside, the building appeared unchanged, still part of the familiar architecture of Isla Vista student housing. Lights in nearby units remained on, unaware of what had occurred only a few feet away behind closed walls. When officers entered the apartment, they encountered a space that did not immediately reflect chaos in the conventional sense. There were no signs of struggle visible from a distance, no external indication that something irreversible had already occurred inside. It was only upon closer inspection that the reality of the situation became undeniable. The interior contained evidence that required immediate containment and documentation. The atmosphere inside shifted the perspective of everyone present, transforming a routine response into a high-priority crime scene. Radios that had previously carried fragmented updates now focused on securing the location and preventing contamination of evidence. The apartment became the first fixed point in what was still a rapidly expanding investigation. Outside, Isla Vista remained in motion, but that motion was increasingly fragmented. Students, who had been moving freely through streets minutes earlier, were now either sheltering in place or attempting to leave the area entirely. The flow of movement that normally defined the community had broken into irregular patterns. Some individuals ran without knowing the full reason, driven by instinct and partial information. Others remained stationary, trying to interpret incomplete messages on their phones or from passing voices. As officers secured the initial scene, additional reports continued to emerge from surrounding areas. These reports suggested that the situation was not confined to a single location. Instead, there appeared to be multiple points of impact across a relatively small geographic space. This realization changed the nature of the response. What had initially been approached as a localized incident was now understood to be a broader, unfolding threat within the community. The difficulty in the early phase of the investigation was the absence of a unified narrative. Witness accounts varied significantly depending on location and timing. Some described hearing loud disturbances without visual confirmation. Others reported seeing individuals running, but were unsure of the cause. A few provided more direct observations, but even those were fragmented by shock and urgency. In environments like Isla Vista, where noise and activity are constant, distinguishing between ordinary disruption and extraordinary danger becomes a complex task in the first moments. Emergency dispatch centers were inundated with calls that reflected this uncertainty. Operators had to filter through overlapping reports, attempting to identify patterns without prematurely dismissing any detail. The process of triaging information became critical, as resources needed to be directed efficiently while avoiding misallocation in a rapidly evolving situation. As additional officers arrived, the focus expanded outward from the initial apartment. The layout of Isla Vista presented both advantages and challenges for response teams. Its compact structure meant that multiple locations could be reached quickly, but its density also created obstacles in distinguishing between witnesses, participants, and bystanders. Narrow streets, pedestrian-heavy pathways, and clustered housing units made it difficult to establish clear lines of sight or movement. At the same time, the presence of students moving through the area complicated situational awareness. In the early confusion, it was not always immediately clear who was fleeing danger and who was simply reacting to noise or rumor. This ambiguity required responders to operate with heightened caution, balancing urgency with the need to avoid escalating panic further. As the perimeter around the initial scene was established, investigators began the process of documenting evidence. The environment inside the apartment was treated as the starting point of a timeline that still needed to be reconstructed. Every detail, from object placement to spatial arrangement, became part of an effort to understand sequence and intent. At this stage, however, conclusions were still premature. The priority was preservation rather than interpretation. Outside, the situation continued to evolve. Additional locations within Isla Vista were now being reported as possible points of concern. The challenge for command units was to determine whether these reports were connected or coincidental. In fast-moving incidents, the risk of misinformation increases significantly, especially when communication is fragmented and emotional intensity is high. Helicopter surveillance provided a broader view of the area, but even from above, clarity was limited by the density of structures and movement below. Lights from emergency vehicles created shifting patterns across streets, while clusters of people moved unpredictably through intersections and open spaces. From a strategic perspective, the environment resembled a constantly changing map, where new information could alter priorities within seconds. As more officers were deployed into Isla Vista, contact with residents became an essential part of building situational awareness. Individuals who had witnessed events firsthand provided accounts that helped refine the understanding of what was unfolding. However, these accounts were often shaped by proximity, emotional response, and incomplete observation. As a result, investigators had to carefully compare multiple testimonies before drawing operational conclusions. Inside the community, fear spread unevenly. Some residents were fully aware that a major incident was underway, while others remained partially informed or entirely unaware depending on their location and access to communication. This uneven distribution of information created a layered psychological landscape, where understanding of the situation varied dramatically within short physical distances. As the investigation expanded, attention gradually shifted from reaction to reconstruction. The initial priority of securing scenes began to merge with the need to establish a coherent sequence of events. This process required coordination between multiple agencies, each contributing different forms of expertise. Forensic teams focused on physical evidence, while law enforcement units mapped movement patterns and communication timelines. At the same time, the emotional weight of the situation began to surface among responders themselves. Although trained to operate in high-pressure environments, the density and suddenness of the incident in a familiar community added a layer of complexity that extended beyond procedural response. The proximity of the event to everyday student life made the contrast between normality and violence particularly stark. As night gave way to early morning, the initial chaos began to stabilize into structured response zones. Areas were cordoned off, access points controlled, and investigative procedures formally established. What had begun as fragmented emergency response was transitioning into a coordinated investigation. Yet even as structure increased, uncertainty remained present in many aspects of the case. The discovery of the initial crime scene marked only the beginning of a longer investigative process. Each subsequent location, each witness statement, and each piece of physical evidence contributed to a growing, but still incomplete understanding of what had occurred. The challenge was not only to document what had happened, but to connect disparate elements into a coherent timeline that could withstand scrutiny. By the time the immediate threat had been contained, Isla Vista was already entering a new phase of reality. The streets that had been filled with confusion were now dominated by emergency presence. Students who had sheltered in place began to emerge cautiously, encountering a transformed environment marked by police activity and restricted movement. The discovery phase of the investigation did not conclude with a single moment of clarity. Instead, it unfolded gradually, as each new piece of information added structure to what had initially been chaos. And even as that structure developed, the full scope of the incident remained something that would take time to fully understand, both for those directly involved in the investigation and for the community trying to comprehend what had occurred within its boundaries. In the hours after the immediate threat had ended in Isla Vista, the investigation entered a phase that is often the most psychologically complex in any major violent case. The physical danger may have passed, but uncertainty had not. If anything, it had expanded. Law enforcement agencies were now faced with a rapidly growing network of fragments, partial witness accounts, scattered scenes, conflicting timelines, and an overwhelming volume of emotional testimony from a community still in shock. At first, there was no single suspect profile that clearly explained what had happened. Officers were working with descriptions that were inconsistent and shaped by panic. Some witnesses reported a shooter on foot, others described movement in a vehicle, and others still were unsure whether what they had seen was connected to the same sequence of events. In a dense environment like Isla Vista, where movement and noise are constant, the line between observation and interpretation becomes blurred under stress. The challenge for investigators was not only to identify a suspect, but to separate truth from distortion created by fear. In the first operational briefings, the situation was treated as fluid. Units were instructed to prioritize safety, gather information, and avoid assumptions. The priority was containment and clarity, but clarity was still distant. Initial investigative efforts focused heavily on mapping the physical locations of reported incidents. Teams moved systematically through Isla Vista, documenting intersections, sidewalks, and residential clusters where activity had been reported. Each location told a partial story, but none of them fully explained the sequence. It was like trying to reconstruct a film from scattered frames without knowing the order. At the same time, attention quickly turned toward the initial apartment scene. Evidence collected there suggested a critical starting point, but even that location raised questions rather than immediate answers. Investigators had to determine not only what had occurred inside, but how it connected to events outside. The transition from private violence to public movement was now the central focus of the inquiry. One of the early difficulties in the investigation was the absence of a clear external warning system. There had been no single moment when the broader community was alerted in advance. Instead, awareness spread unevenly through social channels and word of mouth. This meant that by the time official confirmation began to emerge, the situation had already unfolded across multiple locations. As investigators interviewed witnesses, patterns began to emerge, but they were still incomplete. Some accounts described a vehicle moving through the area in a manner that seemed intentional rather than random. Others focused on sudden encounters on foot. The challenge was that Isla Vista's layout allowed for rapid transitions between dense pedestrian zones and narrow driving corridors, making it difficult to track movement precisely without corroborating evidence. Law enforcement agencies began cross-referencing emergency call logs with physical evidence and surveillance footage. The process was methodical, but slow. Each piece of data had to be verified, then placed within a developing timeline. This reconstruction effort required coordination between multiple jurisdictions, forensic analysts, and field investigators, all working under significant time pressure and public scrutiny. At this stage, the identity of the suspect was not yet fully confirmed to all units, and there was still a degree of operational caution in public communication. In rapidly evolving incidents, premature release of information can create confusion, so authorities worked carefully to ensure that details were verified before dissemination. This created a gap between what was known internally and what was understood by the public. Within Isla Vista itself, residents were also attempting to reconstruct the night from their own fragmented experiences. Social media became an improvised information network, where individuals shared observations, warnings, and updates. However, this decentralized flow of information often added to confusion, as unverified reports circulated alongside accurate ones. For investigators, this digital layer became both a resource and a challenge. As the timeline began to take shape, a clearer picture of movement emerged. The sequence suggested that the incident began at a fixed location, before expanding outward into the surrounding streets. This pattern shifted the investigative focus toward understanding motive, preparation, and behavioral escalation. Attention turned to the suspect's background, recent activities, and digital footprint. Investigators began examining online activity, personal writings, and communication history. These materials revealed a deeply internalized narrative that had developed over time. Rather than being spontaneous, the actions of that night appeared to be the culmination of a process that had unfolded privately over an extended period. This realization changed the investigative perspective from reactive to analytical. However, even with access to personal materials, interpretation remained complex. Law enforcement had to distinguish between expression and intent, between frustration and actionable planning. Not all signs of distress or hostility translate into predictive indicators of violence. The challenge was to identify which elements were relevant to the timeline of the incident and which were part of broader, non-specific behavior patterns. Meanwhile, forensic teams continued to process physical evidence from multiple locations. Each site required careful documentation, including spatial mapping, trace evidence collection, and cross-referencing with witness accounts. The goal was to build a synchronized timeline that could account for movement across time and geography. One of the key breakthroughs in this phase came from aligning witness reports with physical evidence that confirmed the use of a vehicle during part of the sequence. This helped reduce ambiguity about movement patterns and allowed investigators to narrow down the suspect's path through Isla Vista. It also helped clarify the connection between separate incidents that had initially appeared unrelated. As the timeline became more defined, the scale of coordination required to respond to the incident became clearer. Multiple emergency units had been deployed across a small geographic area in a short period of time, often without full knowledge of each other's positions. This highlighted the difficulty of managing rapidly unfolding, multi-location incidents in densely populated environments. At the same time, communication with the public remained a critical component of the investigation. Authorities needed to balance transparency with accuracy, ensuring that information released did not compromise ongoing operations or contribute to misinformation. In the absence of complete clarity, uncertainty often filled the gaps. Within the community, the psychological impact of the investigation phase was significant. Residents were not only processing what had happened, but also attempting to understand how it could have occurred within a familiar environment. The sense of safety that had previously defined Isla Vista was now under reconsideration. Spaces that had once felt routine were now associated with uncertainty. As more information was confirmed, attention shifted toward the final moments of the incident. Investigators worked to reconstruct the sequence that led to the conclusion of the event, including law enforcement engagement and the eventual resolution of the immediate threat. This required precise synchronization of timestamped data, radio communications, and witness accounts. Even as clarity increased, certain aspects of the investigation remained difficult to fully reconstruct. High-stress environments often produce gaps in perception, and not every moment can be captured with equal accuracy. Investigators had to account for these limitations when building the final narrative of events. By the end of this phase, a more coherent understanding of the incident had begun to emerge. The fragmented reports of the early hours had been organized into a structured timeline. The movement of the suspect, the locations of the attacks, and the response of law enforcement were now connected in a way that allowed for analysis rather than speculation. However, even with this structure in place, the emotional weight of the investigation remained present. For those involved in the response, the process of moving from confusion to clarity did not diminish the impact of what had occurred. Instead, it reinforced the scale of the event and the complexity of the conditions that allowed it to unfold. The investigation in Isla Vista was no longer just about identifying what happened. It had become an effort to understand how a sequence of actions, unfolding over a relatively short period of time, could intersect so profoundly with a community's sense of normal life. And in that question, the work of reconstruction continued beyond evidence and timelines, extending into broader reflections that would persist long after the immediate investigation phase had ended. As the investigation in Isla Vista moved beyond the initial chaos and into structured analysis, a critical turning point began to emerge, one that would reshape the entire understanding of the case. In most violent incidents, there is a moment when scattered fragments begin to align into a pattern that investigators can follow with increasing clarity. In this case, that moment did not arrive suddenly. It formed gradually, through accumulation rather than revelation, until the outline of a single individual's actions became impossible to ignore. The breakthrough did not come from a single piece of evidence, but from the convergence of multiple independent sources. Witness accounts that had initially seemed inconsistent began to overlap in subtle but significant ways. Vehicle descriptions, movement patterns, and timing references started to align when placed on a unified timeline. What had once appeared as disconnected chaos began to reveal a structured sequence of behavior. One of the most important developments came from linking surveillance footage with emergency call data. Although not every area of Isla Vista was covered by cameras, the available recordings provided enough reference points to establish a partial movement path. When these visual fragments were combined with witness testimony, a clearer trajectory began to take shape. It suggested deliberate navigation through specific zones rather than random movement. At the same time, forensic analysis from the initial apartment scene provided a foundational anchor for the timeline. This location had already been identified as the starting point of the incident, but its significance became more pronounced as external data confirmed that subsequent events followed immediately after its discovery. The timing between internal and external phases of the attack was now narrowing into a continuous sequence. As investigators refined the timeline, attention turned more sharply toward identifying the individual responsible. While early reports had been cautious and fragmented, the accumulation of evidence began to point toward a single suspect, whose presence was increasingly consistent across multiple points of reference. This shift in focus marked the beginning of the operational breakthrough phase. The identification process was supported by a combination of digital records, witness descriptions, and vehicle tracking information. Each layer added a piece to the larger puzzle. Importantly, it was not any single source that confirmed identity, but the convergence of multiple independent confirmations that created investigative certainty. In complex cases, this convergence is often the decisive factor that transitions suspicion into confirmation. Once the suspect's identity was established within investigative units, attention shifted toward reconstructing intent and behavioral escalation. Investigators began examining the timeline leading up to the incident in greater detail, focusing on patterns that could indicate planning or premeditation. This phase required careful separation of long-term behavioral history from immediate actions relevant to the event itself. Digital evidence played a significant role in this stage of analysis. Online activity, personal writings, and recorded expressions of thought were reviewed to understand the psychological framework behind the actions. These materials revealed a pattern of increasing fixation on themes of isolation, perceived injustice, and frustration with social interaction. While such expressions alone do not predict violence, in the context of the timeline they provided important insight into internal escalation. However, investigators were careful not to interpret these materials in isolation. Behavioral analysis required cross-referencing with physical evidence and real-world actions. The goal was not to construct a narrative based on perception, but to ground conclusions in verifiable movement and timing. This distinction is critical in ensuring that investigative findings remain evidential rather than speculative. As the timeline solidified, the sequence of events became increasingly clear. The incident was no longer viewed as a series of disconnected acts, but as a continuous progression that began in a private setting and extended outward into public space. This realization significantly altered the understanding of how the event unfolded, shifting focus toward pre-event behavior and logistical preparation. One of the most significant confirmations during this phase came from the alignment of time-stamped data across multiple sources. Phone records, emergency dispatch logs, and surveillance timestamps were synchronized to establish a precise chronology. This allowed investigators to reduce uncertainty regarding the order of events and identify the narrow windows between each phase of the incident. As the timeline tightened, law enforcement units were able to reconstruct the suspect's movements with increasing accuracy. This reconstruction included transitions between locations, interactions within public areas, and the final moments leading to the conclusion of the event. Each segment of movement contributed to a comprehensive understanding of how the incident developed spatially and temporally. At the same time, operational command centers worked to ensure that all field units were updated with the latest verified information. Communication became increasingly structured as the investigation transitioned from reactive response to analytical containment. This shift allowed for more coordinated decision-making and reduced the risk of contradictory actions in the field. Despite these advancements, uncertainty still existed in certain areas of the timeline. In any rapidly evolving incident, there are moments that cannot be fully reconstructed due to gaps in observation or limitations in available data. Investigators had to account for these gaps while maintaining overall structural integrity of the timeline. As the breakthrough phase progressed, attention also turned toward understanding the broader implications of the suspect's movement through Isla Vista. The geography of the area played a significant role in shaping how the incident unfolded. Narrow streets, dense housing clusters, and high pedestrian density created conditions that influenced both visibility and response time. This environmental context became an important factor in analyzing how events escalated so quickly across multiple locations. In dense urban settings like Isla Vista, movement can transition rapidly between visibility and obscurity, making real-time tracking difficult without coordinated surveillance coverage. This characteristic of the environment contributed to the complexity of the response. Meanwhile, within the community, partial understanding of the situation was beginning to solidify into broader awareness. Residents, who had initially relied on fragmented information, were now receiving more consistent updates through official channels. This shift helped stabilize public perception, although emotional processing of the event was still ongoing. For investigators, the transition from uncertainty to structured understanding did not reduce the complexity of the case. Instead, it introduced a new phase focused on verification and refinement. Each established fact had to be confirmed across multiple sources before being incorporated into the final narrative of events. As the suspect's identity became fully confirmed across agencies, coordination increased between local law enforcement, federal units, and forensic teams. This multi-agency collaboration ensured that all aspects of the investigation were aligned, from evidence collection to timeline reconstruction and behavioral analysis. One of the key outcomes of this phase was the establishment of a continuous narrative that connected all major points of the incident. This narrative did not rely on assumptions or interpretation alone, but on verified intersections between physical evidence, digital records, and eyewitness testimony. It represented the first complete structural understanding of the event. Even with this clarity, investigators remained aware that the breakthrough phase was not the end of analysis. It was a transition point between uncertainty and deeper examination. Questions about motivation, warning signs, and systemic gaps remained open for further study. The focus now expanded beyond immediate reconstruction toward broader interpretation. In this sense, the breakthrough was not only about identifying a suspect or establishing a timeline. It was about transforming fragmented chaos into structured knowledge that could be analyzed, shared, and eventually used to inform future prevention efforts. The process marked a shift from reaction to understanding. By the end of this phase, the investigation had moved from confusion into clarity, but not closure. The events in Isla Vista were now mapped in detail, yet their meaning continued to extend beyond the boundaries of the immediate case. And within that expansion, the work of interpretation was only beginning. In the aftermath of the Isla Vista attack, the legal system did not proceed in the traditional way it would for a surviving defendant. There was no trial in the conventional sense, no courtroom confrontation between prosecution and defense, no gradual presentation of testimony before a jury tasked with determining guilt or innocence. Instead, the judicial dimension of the case shifted almost immediately into a different form of reckoning, one defined more by documentation, interpretation, and public accountability than by adversarial process. Even without a living defendant, the structure of justice still had to be activated. Law enforcement agencies, forensic experts, and legal authorities were required to formally establish the facts of the case in a way that could withstand scrutiny. This process was not only about determining what had happened, but about creating an official record that could serve both legal and societal purposes. In cases of mass violence, this record becomes a critical reference point for future prevention efforts and policy discussions. The absence of a courtroom trial did not reduce the complexity of the investigative findings. If anything, it intensified the need for precision. Every detail that would normally be tested in cross-examination now had to be verified internally through documentation, expert review, and corroboration across multiple independent sources. The responsibility of establishing truth shifted entirely onto investigators and forensic analysts. At the center of this legal reconstruction was the question of intent. While the sequence of events had been established through physical and digital evidence, understanding why those events occurred required careful interpretation of behavioral history, personal writings, and recorded expressions of thought. These materials were examined not as isolated statements, but as part of a broader pattern of psychological escalation over time. However, legal interpretation does not operate on psychological analysis alone. The justice system requires a standard of evidence that can be consistently applied. This meant that investigators had to distinguish between explanatory context and legally relevant causation. Not every expression of frustration or isolation could be treated as indicative of criminal intent. The challenge was to identify which elements were directly connected to the planning and execution of the attack. As official reports were compiled, the narrative of the case began to take formal shape. This narrative included a detailed timeline of events, identification of victims, reconstruction of movement patterns, and analysis of decision-making processes leading up to the incident. Each section of the report was designed to answer specific legal and procedural questions, rather than emotional or speculative ones. In the absence of a trial, these reports became the closest equivalent to judicial proceedings. They were reviewed by multiple agencies, summarized for public release, and archived as official records. Their language was deliberately precise, avoiding interpretation beyond what could be supported by evidence. This approach was necessary to maintain legal integrity, even in a case that had already reached its physical conclusion. At the same time, the question of accountability extended beyond the individual case itself. Legal and governmental institutions began examining whether existing systems had been sufficient to identify and respond to warning signs prior to the event. This included reviewing communication protocols, mental health intervention frameworks, and law enforcement response structures. One of the most difficult aspects of this review process was determining the threshold at which intervention becomes possible or legally justified. Many of the behavioral indicators identified in hindsight existed in fragmented forms across different contexts. Some were expressed in private environments, others in online spaces, and others still in social interactions that did not clearly signal imminent danger when viewed in isolation. This fragmentation raised important questions about the limits of predictive systems. Even when concerning behavior is present, the challenge lies in determining when it forms a coherent pattern that requires action. The Isla Vista case became a focal point for this discussion, as it illustrated how disconnected indicators can exist without triggering a unified response. In legal terms, the absence of intervention does not automatically imply failure. Systems are designed around thresholds of evidence, not retrospective certainty. However, the emotional weight of the outcome inevitably influenced public and institutional reflection on whether those thresholds were appropriately calibrated. As the official findings were released, the focus of public attention shifted toward understanding how such an event could occur within a modern, densely monitored society. The presence of surveillance systems, digital communication networks, and institutional awareness did not prevent the incident, leading to broader discussions about the limits of observation-based prevention. Legal experts emphasized that prevention in such cases is not solely a matter of information availability, but of interpretation, prioritization, and resource allocation. Even when data exists, it must be correctly identified as significant within a vast field of unrelated signals. This challenge is not unique to law enforcement, but extends to many systems that deal with complex human behavior. The formal conclusion of the investigative and legal process did not bring closure in the emotional sense. Instead, it established a documented account that could be referenced for future analysis. This distinction between legal resolution and emotional resolution became an important aspect of public discourse in the months that followed. Court proceedings typically serve not only to determine responsibility, but also to provide a structured space for testimony, confrontation, and narrative resolution. In this case, the absence of a defendant meant that many of those functions were redirected into alternative forms, such as public reports, memorial statements, and institutional reviews. While these structures provided information, they did not replicate the experimental dimension of a trial. For families of victims, this created a complex emotional landscape. The absence of courtroom proceedings meant there was no formal space in which to witness legal accountability being enacted in real time. Instead, closure had to be pursued through documentation, public statements, and private grieving processes that existed outside the judicial framework. Within the broader community, the release of official findings served as a point of transition from immediate crisis to long-term reflection. Attention began to move away from operational details of the incident and toward systemic questions about prevention, mental health infrastructure, and community safety. These discussions extended beyond Isla Vista, influencing national conversations about similar environments. The legal record of the case also became an important resource for researchers, policymakers, and mental health professionals. It provided a detailed account of how multiple factors, behavioral, environmental, and systemic, intersected over time. While no single explanation could fully account for the outcome, the documentation allowed for a structured analysis of contributing elements. As time passed, the absence of a traditional trial did not diminish the legal significance of the case, but it did alter its place within the justice system. It became a reference point for how certain types of incidents are processed when the conventional mechanisms of adjudication are no longer applicable. In this sense, the Isla Vista case occupies a unique position within legal discourse. It exists simultaneously as a concluded investigation and as an ongoing subject of analysis. The formal procedures of justice reached their endpoint quickly, but the interpretive work surrounding those procedures continues in academic, institutional, and public spaces. The courtroom, in its physical absence, was replaced by a distributed system of documentation and reflection. And within that system, the question of justice shifted from determining guilt to understanding process, from assigning punishment to examining structure, and from closure to continuous learning. In the end, the legal dimension of the case does not stand alone. It is interwoven with the investigative, psychological, and societal dimensions that surround it. And while the formal process reached its conclusion, the broader questions it raised remain active, extending far beyond the boundaries of any single judicial moment. In the days after the Isla Vista attack, silence did not arrive all at once. It settled in layers, unevenly, as if the community itself was struggling to decide how to exist in the absence of what had just occurred. Streets that only days earlier had been filled with movement, laughter, and the casual chaos of student life now carried a different kind of stillness. It was not peace, and it was not normalcy. It was something heavier, a silence shaped by shock and disbelief, interrupted only by the constant presence of investigators, reporters, and memorial gatherings. For many residents, the first real moment of understanding came not from official statements, but from returning to familiar places and realizing they no longer felt the same. The apartment complexes, sidewalks, and intersections of Isla Vista had not physically changed, yet every space seemed altered by memory. Even ordinary sounds, like doors closing or bicycles passing, carried new emotional weight. The environment had become layered with association, where nothing could be experienced without reference to what had happened. The aftermath also brought an immediate shift in behavior. Students, who had once moved freely through the community, now traveled in groups or stayed indoors. Conversations that previously revolved around classes, relationships, and daily plans were replaced with discussions about safety, uncertainty, and emotional processing. Even those who had not been directly involved in the incident found themselves affected by proximity alone. In a place as dense and interconnected as Isla Vista, distance offered little protection from psychological impact. Outside the community, the story quickly expanded into national and international attention. Media outlets arrived within hours, transforming Isla Vista into a focal point of coverage that extended far beyond its physical boundaries. The narrative began to take shape in public discourse, but it was still fragmented, shaped by early reports, partial information, and the emotional intensity of the moment. As details were confirmed, the focus shifted from immediate description to broader interpretation. The identity of Elliot Rodger became central to that interpretation, not because it provided simple answers, but because it raised difficult questions. His background, online activity, and personal history were examined in detail, often through multiple competing perspectives. Some focused on psychological factors, others on social isolation, and others on cultural influences. No single explanation was sufficient on its own, and this complexity became a defining feature of the public conversation. Within Isla Vista itself, the process of mourning was deeply personal and varied. Memorials were held in different locations, ranging from informal gatherings on sidewalks to organized campus events. Candles, photographs, and handwritten messages began to appear in public spaces, gradually transforming parts of the community into sites of remembrance. These acts of collective grief provided structure to emotions that were otherwise difficult to express. Families of the victims faced a different kind of aftermath, one shaped by absence rather than public visibility. Their experience extended beyond the immediate shock into a long-term adjustment to loss. In interviews and statements, many described not only grief, but also the difficulty of reconciling memory with sudden absence. The lives of their loved ones were now preserved in fragments, through stories, photographs, and shared recollections. At the same time, the broader public began to engage with questions that extended beyond the specific incident. Discussions about mental health systems, early warning signs, and intervention frameworks became more prominent. There was a growing recognition that the conditions surrounding the case were not isolated, but part of larger structural issues that required attention at multiple levels. Online spaces also became a major site of reflection and debate. Social media platforms circulated information rapidly, allowing people to share reactions, analyses, and emotional responses. However, this speed of communication also led to challenges, as misinformation and speculation sometimes spread alongside verified facts. Moderating these discussions became an ongoing issue for both platforms and communities attempting to process the event responsibly. In academic and policy circles, the Isla Vista case began to be studied as an example of how multiple systems can intersect in ways that are difficult to predict. Researchers examined the relationship between individual behavior, digital environments, and community structures. The goal was not to simplify the case, but to understand how different factors might align under certain conditions to produce extreme outcomes. Within law enforcement and emergency response agencies, the incident prompted internal reviews of communication protocols and response strategies. While the immediate operational response had been rapid under difficult conditions, questions remained about how information flowed during the early stages of the event. These reviews focused on improving coordination in densely populated, fast-moving environments where information is often incomplete. Despite the extensive analysis that followed, there was no single point of closure that marked the end of the aftermath. Instead, the community experienced a gradual transition from immediate crisis to long-term reflection. Over time, the visible presence of emergency activity decreased, but the emotional and psychological impact remained embedded in daily life. For students who were present in Isla Vista during that period, the experience became part of their personal history in a way that was difficult to separate from other aspects of their time there. Some chose to leave the area, while others stayed, continuing their studies while carrying the memory of what had occurred. In both cases, the incident became a reference point that shaped how they understood safety, community, and vulnerability. Public discourse eventually expanded beyond the specific details of the case to include broader societal questions. How do communities recognize early signs of extreme isolation? What role do digital environments play in reinforcing harmful patterns of thought? How can institutions balance privacy with the need for intervention? These questions did not have simple answers, but they became part of ongoing conversations in multiple fields. Over time, Isla Vista began to return to its normal rhythm, at least on the surface. Students once again filled the streets, apartments became occupied, and daily routines resumed. But beneath that surface continuity, the memory of the incident remained present. It was not always visible, but it influenced how people moved through space, how they interpreted silence, and how they responded to unfamiliar situations. The aftermath also left a lasting imprint on how similar communities think about preparedness and awareness. While no system can fully prevent unpredictable acts of violence, the case highlighted the importance of recognizing patterns of isolation and distress within social environments. It also underscored the limits of prediction when behavior is distributed across multiple contexts and platforms. In the broader cultural sense, the Isla Vista attack became part of an ongoing conversation about violence, identity, and social connection in modern society. It was referenced in discussions not only about safety, but also about belonging and alienation. The case did not provide definitive answers, but it forced a confrontation with questions that are often difficult to address directly. As time continued to pass, the intensity of public attention gradually decreased, but the significance of the event did not disappear. It remained embedded in institutional memory, academic study, and personal recollection. For those directly affected, the aftermath did not conclude at a specific moment. It continued in quieter, less visible forms, shaped by memory, adaptation, and the ongoing process of understanding what had been lost. In the end, the Isla Vista incident became more than a single night of violence. It became a long-term point of reflection about how communities function under pressure, how individuals experience isolation within dense social environments, and how society interprets events that resist simple explanation. And within that reflection, the aftermath continues, not as a finished chapter, but as an ongoing process of meaning-making that extends far beyond the boundaries of the event itself. In the months following the Isla Vista attack, attention gradually shifted away from the immediate shock of the event and toward the deeper question that refused to fade. How could something like this happen in a place that, on the surface, looked so ordinary? Isla Vista had returned to its familiar rhythm, but nothing about the way people experienced that rhythm remained unchanged. The same sidewalks, the same apartment buildings, the same intersections carried a different emotional weight, as if the entire environment had absorbed a memory it could not release. For investigators, the official case had already entered its final procedural stages. Reports were filed, timelines were finalized, and evidence was archived. But in many ways, the end of the investigation marked the beginning of a longer process of interpretation. The facts of what happened were no longer in question. What remained unresolved was why those facts had aligned in the way they did, and whether anything in the surrounding systems could have altered the outcome. This question quickly extended beyond law enforcement and into academic and policy discussions. Universities, mental health professionals, and public safety experts began examining the case as part of a broader pattern of rare, but highly impactful acts of mass violence. The focus was not on finding a single cause, but on understanding how multiple factors can intersect without warning signs reaching a threshold that triggers intervention. One of the most difficult aspects of this analysis was the fragmented nature of behavioral indicators. In hindsight, patterns often appear clear, even inevitable. But in real time, those same signals are distributed across different environments and contexts. Some exist in private thoughts, others in online interactions, and others still in brief social encounters that do not provide enough information on their own to justify action. The challenge lies in determining when fragments become a pattern. In the case of Elliot Rodger, this fragmentation became a central point of discussion. His behavior, both online and offline, had included expressions of isolation and frustration over time, but these existed alongside periods of routine functioning. This duality made interpretation complex. It also raised difficult questions about the limits of predictive systems that rely on observable thresholds rather than internal states. Mental health professionals emphasized that isolation alone cannot be treated as a reliable predictor of violence. Many individuals experience social withdrawal or emotional distress without ever engaging in harmful behavior. The challenge, therefore, is not simply identifying isolation, but understanding when it becomes part of a broader trajectory that includes escalation, fixation, and loss of adaptive coping mechanisms. Even then, prediction remains probabilistic rather than definitive. Within Isla Vista, the conversation about prevention became more immediate and personal. Students and residents began reflecting on how social environments function in dense, high-turnover communities. In places where people are constantly surrounded by others, it is possible for individuals to remain unnoticed in their distress. This paradox, where visibility does not guarantee recognition, became a central theme in local discussions. Community organizations and university administrators began reviewing support systems available to students, particularly those experiencing social or emotional difficulties. Counseling services, peer support networks, and outreach programs were evaluated for accessibility and effectiveness. The goal was not only to increase resources, but also to improve awareness of how and when those resources are used. At the same time, there was a growing recognition that institutional systems alone cannot fully address the complexity of human behavior. Even well-designed support structures depend on individuals recognizing their own need for help and others recognizing signs of distress in time to respond. This mutual dependency creates gaps that are difficult to eliminate entirely. In digital spaces, the case also prompted reflection on the role of online environments in shaping perception and belief. Analysts examined how isolated individuals can find reinforcement for distorted interpretations of social reality through repeated exposure to specific communities or narratives. This does not mean that online environments directly cause violence, but that they can contribute to the reinforcement of existing beliefs in ways that are difficult to interrupt without external intervention. Social media platforms, forum communities, and content recommendation systems all became part of this broader discussion. Questions were raised about how algorithms amplify certain types of content, and how moderation systems can identify patterns of concern without overreaching into personal expression. These debates did not produce immediate solutions, but they contributed to ongoing adjustments in platform policies. Meanwhile, in academic settings, the Isla Vista case became a subject of multidisciplinary study. Psychologists, sociologists, criminologists, and data analysts each approached the event from different angles. Some focused on individual behavioral development, others on environmental factors, and others on systemic response failures. What emerged was not a unified theory, but a layered understanding of complexity. One recurring theme across these studies was the concept of visibility versus understanding. In many environments, signs of distress may be visible, but not recognized as significant. This gap between observation and interpretation is not a failure of awareness alone, but a structural limitation in how information is processed within large, dynamic communities. As time passed, the emotional intensity surrounding the event gradually shifted into a quieter form of remembrance. Memorials remained, but they became less frequent. Public discussion continued, but with less immediacy. Yet within families, among close friends, and within the Isla Vista community itself, the impact persisted in more subtle ways. Certain dates, locations, and conversations retained a lasting emotional resonance. The physical environment of Isla Vista also reflected this gradual transition. While life resumed, there were moments when collective memory surfaced unexpectedly. A sidewalk, a building, or an intersection could momentarily disrupt routine perception, reminding those present of what had occurred. These moments were not constant, but they were persistent enough to shape long-term experience. For those studying the case, one of the most important realizations was that prevention cannot rely solely on identifying extreme cases in advance. Instead, it requires building systems that are capable of responding to a wide range of signals at different levels of intensity. This includes not only high-risk indicators, but also earlier stages of isolation, disengagement, and emotional distress. However, even with improved systems, uncertainty remains an unavoidable part of human behavior. Not all risk can be detected in advance, and not all intervention opportunities present themselves clearly. This limitation is not unique to Isla Vista, but it became particularly visible in this case due to the scale of the outcome. In reflecting on the aftermath, experts often return to the distinction between explanation and prevention. An event can be explained in detail after it occurs, but that explanation does not automatically translate into prevention for future cases. The challenge lies in transforming retrospective understanding into forward-facing systems, without overgeneralizing or misinterpreting individual behavior. Ultimately, the Isla Vista case became more than a singular event. It became a reference point in ongoing discussions about how modern communities understand risk, isolation, and intervention. It highlighted the limits of prediction, the complexity of human behavior, and the difficulty of translating awareness into action. Even as the case moved further into the past, its influence continued to shape conversations in policy, education, and mental health fields. It served as a reminder that beneath the surface of everyday environments, individual experiences can diverge in ways that are not always immediately visible. And in that space between visibility and understanding, the questions raised by Isla Vista remain open, not as unresolved details of a closed case, but as ongoing challenges that continue to shape how communities think about connection, responsibility, and the fragile boundaries of normal life.